Okay, I want to talk about causation.
Okay.
Let's go to how physics is ordinarily said. I'm not talking about the equations on the board. Most of the time when people are talking about physics, they'll speak about physics in terms of causal accounts. I'll throw the ball and that will cause you to fall down to the ground when it hits your face or what have you.
Okay.
Then when they're drawing equations on the board, they're just equations with evolution. And then you could always ask the professor, where is causation here? Like, what variable is causal? What's going on? And then they may say, well, ultimately in physics, fundamentally, there is no causation. That causation is the story. And even in this other account of a projectile being thrown or the rooster crowing, Emily Adlam, who I spoke to a few months ago, and I'll place the link on screen, my recollection of, or my understanding of her theory is that there is no causation, and you can also tell a story where the end is somehow constraining the beginning part. So these variables that you mentioned with the maximum height and the angle and so forth, you could just give the maximum height, and you don't have to talk about causal stories. Then when I heard you speak about causation, you said interventions. Now, interventions to me imply agents. And so if one was to give a fundamental account of causation, it would seem to me that you're placing an agent or an intervention fundamentally in physics. And I just don't see that there. So I need help to understand.
There's certainly, so I don't subscribe to the view that we need agents and the notion of intervention to define causation. There are some researchers who certainly do push for that view of causation, that it's sort of defined in terms of interventions. I would rather say that a good way to get a handle, a good way to get evidence about what the true causal structure is with intervention. So if I can afford to do a randomized drug trial, that's a kind of intervention where I give somebody a drug or a placebo, not based on their preferences, but just based on the outcome of a coin flip. And then I can be sure that when I see a correlation with recovery, it's by virtue of the causal effectiveness of the drug, because there was no common cause to the outcome of the coin flip and their recovery. Unlike an example where health awareness or something might influence somebody's decision to take the treatment and influence their likelihood of recovering.
Right.
So interventions are a great way of getting a hold of what's going on causally, but I don't think it's part of the definition of causation. I would say rather we have to reach for just the notion of counterfactuals. That when I think about classical physics and I say, well, what does it mean to have the law of projectile motion? In what sense is it a law? It's not just an account of every cannonball flight that ever was in history. No, it's a law in the sense that it allows you to reason about counterfactuals, to make inferences. Had the velocity of the cannonball been different, this is what the maximum height would have been. It allows us to make all those inferences, right? So it basically stipulates a functional dependence of some effect variable on the variables that are the causes of that effect. So yeah, I think generally we don't kind of formalize it. That's all kind of in the words that go along with things. So if I'm doing a problem on projectiles of cannonballs and I get asked, what happened if you went and you modified where the cannonball went by grabbing a hold of it and moving it? Would that impact the cannon? And no, of course not. Like we know enough to understand what the cause-effect relations are in those circumstances. So I think that generically in our physical theories, there is part of the theory that tells us, what the causal mechanisms are. I think it makes sense to imagine causes always proceeding from past to future, not in the other direction. So I don't see any reason to depart from that. So in other words, I think causation is a fundamental primitive of descriptions of physical theories. And even though you're right that a lot of people, including some famous people, have said causation doesn't belong in physics, I disagree. It seems to me that it's a mistake to try to exclude notions of causation from physical theories. For me, it's quite the opposite. So since the late 80s and 90s, this subfield of statistics called causal inference came along, and they've done quite a nice job of actually adding some mathematical formalism that allows you to talk about causation. And what's remarkable is how well that slots into puzzles in physics, right? So like in quantum theory in particular, I realized that the ability to talk formally about causal relations actually helps very much in sort of understanding what's going on in physics. And so to me, it was a big mistake to try to say that causation is not a part of physics. I think it is, and I don't see any reason why we should go in for backward in time influences or any kind of exotic notions of causation. Right now, it seems to me that I think we can get away with very conventional notions of what causation is, while still being required to innovate them a bit to be able to cover the quantum case. So, in other words, like, when I think about trying to explain the Bell experiment, I think I can get away with a common cause. I don't need anything exotic in terms of what's the structure. Where you do need something exotic is that you're not going to be updating your knowledge by Bayesian probability theory. You're going to have a more exotic formalism for doing that sort of thing.
You said you think you can get away with a common cause?
Yeah,
why not you can? Why do you think it?
Because I don't have an interpretation of quantum theory on the table to tell everyone this is how you should think about quantum theory. It's a research program. So there's principles that I think I can secure in a realist interpretation of quantum theory, but we're not there yet. So the situation is that I think there's a lot of evidence in favor of this being the right direction, but we're not at the end yet. We don't have a story that cleanly separates, what part of the quantum formalism are describing reality. How do we describe our knowledge of that reality? We don't have that. So I like to say that it's that the existing interpretations of quantum theory are sort of like a built house, but I look at them and I think they're all built on shaky foundations because they're all non-Leibnizian in one way or another. What I've got is only the foundation, but I think it's a secure foundation, and we're trying to build up the rest.
It's a great analogy. So my understanding of causal inference is that Pearl?
Yes.
Pearl's work?
Yeah,
okay, so perhaps I didn't get deep enough into Pearl's work. Perhaps it just started out this way and maybe it's evolved. I remember there were do variables.
Mm-hmm.
But in fundamental physics, there is no do variable. Now, operationally, yes, sure. But a do seems to imply an agent, at least to me. So has the theory of causal inference moved beyond do to something more fundamental or something that doesn't require an agent?
Let me try to answer at a kind of more general level, and then we'll come back to this, which is, I would say the definition of causation in the field of causal inference doesn't need to appeal to intervention. It doesn't need to appeal to these do operations. Like I was saying a moment ago, that I think you can define causation without referring to agents at all. But nonetheless, when we're talking about, what evidence do we have? What can I infer about what's going on causally? Often we want to avail ourselves of the fact that I intervened and this is what I saw. And clearly there is a difference about, the probability of recovery given that I made someone take a drug or a placebo versus the probability that they recovered merely after having observed that they took the drug, and not in a randomized controlled trial, right? Because in those two cases, I could have very different inferences. So it makes sense to talk about the agent in terms of like what you can learn. More broadly, I would say, discussions of agents tend to leave many physicists feeling like, oh, this all feels a bit new age, like consciousness is important or something like that. And I don't go in for that sort of stuff. But I think that's really the wrong attitude. That the way I would put it is that there's a long tradition of pragmatism in physics. If I look at the second law of thermodynamics, where did it come from? It came from Carnot studying heat engines and asking, what's the most energy I can get out of a steam engine? So that's a very pragmatic concern. It's about it's about achieving the most efficiency we can, and ultimately that led to the second law of thermodynamics, which is very fundamental in physics and thinking about the evolution of the universe and the evolution of life and places where there are no agents and no steam engines. It has applications there. We came to it by asking questions about not what just happens if I set up these initial conditions and let it go, but rather what are the fundamental limits on what I can achieve of for a certain type of thing if I'm really trying to engineer it to do as well as possible. But that's also something that's constrained by the laws of physics, right? So like the limitation on the speed of any influence could be thought of as a limitation on how quickly I can send signals. Limitations on how much work I can extract from some heat baths tells me something about the laws of physics. Even though it's about these sort of parochial concerns of mine as to like how much energy I can get, it can still tell me something really important about the laws of physics. So similarly, when we start talking about a theory of inference, a theory of knowledge, you might say, "Oh, there's an agent there." But look at thermodynamics. So there was a time when we had various phenomenological thermodynamic laws, and we didn't really understand them. And then statistical mechanics came along. So people like Boltzmann had the kinetic theory of gases, and they recognized that we don't have knowledge of the microscopic configuration of all these particles. So what we're going to do is imagine a probability distribution over all the possible physical states, representing our ignorance of what's going on. And then we're going to ask, okay, how does that probability distribution evolve over time? And what does it allow me to infer about various macroscopic quantities like temperature, volume, pressure, things like that? But all along, there's an acknowledgement that we are ignorant and we have to model our ignorance quantitatively in physics to describe these situations. So it's not as if talking about quantum states as states of knowledge is something highly innovative. It's been there in stat mech forever. We're always talking about probability distributions and our ignorance of the microscopic degrees of freedom. There's nothing about it that is sort of new agey or appeals to consciousness. It's just being quantitative about your ignorance, right? So using the formalism of Bayesian probability theory to talk about your ignorance and doing it quantitatively. So it's really the reverse, actually. It's ironic because when you try to understand the quantum state as being something real, you often find that you have to go in for some idea like, oh, consciousness collapses the wave function, and learning about something late influences the past, like in a Wheeler's delayed choice experiment, that sort of thing. And it's only when you properly formalize, what it would be for a quantum state to represent mere ignorance that these things become very conventional. Like if I learn something in the future, I might update my knowledge about the past. That's not exotic or new agey in any way. It doesn't involve consciousness. It's just I find some fossils in the ground and I infer something about dinosaurs in the past. I haven't caused dinosaurs to exist.
Mhm.
I've updated my information about dinosaurs. So a lot of the odd things in quantum theory, or things that people point to as mysterious, when you bring the agent in and you describe their ignorance, they become much more innocuous.
Times arrow. Does that presuppose causation, or does causation presuppose times arrow? Or are these independent?
Yeah, I think the view that causation is a primitive notion in physics basically presumes that there's an arrow to time. Yes. It's the situation's as follows. So people often point to the fact, let's take Newton's theory as an example. Here's evidence that people will sometimes point to against time zero. They say, look, if you give me the configuration at time zero, then it will completely fix the configuration at some later time, just evolve Newton's laws forward. But similarly, if you give me the state at the final time, I can evolve it back and get the situation at time zero. So there's this time symmetry there. And so there doesn't feel like any asymmetry. And so that means that, why should I say that there's an asymmetry between the past and the future? To me, that feels more like a fact about inference, right? So just like, inferring the existence of dinosaurs from fossils, in Newton's mechanics, if you tell me the configuration of particles at one time, I can infer what the past was. And, and I can also infer the future from the past. But if you ask me, if you imagine a change to the configuration at one time, what do you think that means? And there, I think the intuition is strong that like a change at this time implies a change in the future, but it does not imply a change in the past, right? Because that's the conventional way we think about causation. Certainly, like when we go through the world and we intervene, we understand that our interventions are going to have effects in the future, and they're not going to have effects in the past. So I like to think of the standard arguments for time symmetry as really being arguments for time symmetry of inference, right? Yeah, the theory of inference doesn't care whether you're making inferences from the past to the future or the future to the past. But I think causation does care. And because I think it's a primitive notion, I think there is an arrow of time in our physical theories.
The Economist covers math, physics, philosophy, and AI in a manner that shows how different countries perceive developments and how they impact markets. They recently published a piece on China's new neutrino detector. They cover extending life via mitochondrial transplants, creating an entirely new field of medicine. But it's also not just science. They analyze culture, they analyze finance, economics, business, international affairs across every region. I'm particularly liking their new Insider feature. It was just launched this month. It gives me a front row access to The Economist's internal editorial debates, where senior editors argue through the news with world leaders and policymakers in twice weekly long format shows. Basically, an extremely high quality podcast. Something else you should know about is that if you go to their app, they not only have daily articles, but they also have long form podcasts with their editors and writers. This is also available online. Whether it's scientific innovation or shifting global politics, The Economist provides comprehensive coverage beyond headlines. As a TOE listener, you get a special discount. Head over to economist.com/TOE to subscribe. That's economist.com/TOE for your discount.